Good day, everyone. Today, we'll explore one of the most profound and enduring questions in philosophy. What is the self? This question has intrigued philosophers for millennia, leading to a wide range of interpretations and theories. Understanding the self is central not only to philosophy, but also to psychology, ethics, and even neuroscience. Throughout this lecture, we'll journey through the thoughts of some of history's most influential philosophers, each of whom offers a unique perspective on the nature of the self. Let's get started. We begin with Socrates, a foundational figure in Western philosophy. Socrates didn't write down his ideas. Unfortunately, no written documents were found during his time. Instead, we know of his teachings through the dialogues of his student, Plato. Socrates was deeply concerned with the moral dimensions of the self. His famous dictum, "Know thyself," highlights the importance he placed on self-examination. For Socrates, understanding the self was not just an intellectual exercise, but a moral imperative. He believed that ignorance of oneself, one's true desires, motives, and limitations leads to a misguided life. Socrates' method of dialectical questioning, known as the Socratic method, was aimed at uncovering these deeper truths within us. He argued that the self is fundamentally a moral agent, striving for goodness, and that true wisdom comes from recognizing our own ignorance and continually seeking knowledge and self-improvement. Plato, a student of Socrates, advanced his teacher's ideas by proposing a more structured view of the self. Plato believed that the self is composed of three distinct parts: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive soul. Or, we also know this as the tripartite soul. The rational part of the soul is responsible for logical thinking and wisdom. It seeks truth and is meant to govern the other parts of the soul, while the spirited part is associated with emotions and actions. It embodies courage, will, and the drive for honor, while the appetitive part or appetitive soul is related to desires, particularly physical ones like hunger, thirst, and sexual urges. In Plato's famous allegory of the chariot, he illustrates the soul as a charioteer trying to control two horses, one spirited and the other appetitive. The charioteer must guide the horses in harmony, representing the necessity of balancing these aspects of the self to achieve a virtuous and fulfilling life. For Plato, the true self is the rational soul, which strives to ascend towards the realm of ideal forms, where it can attain true knowledge and align with the divine order. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine of Hippo was a key figure in Christian philosophy, merging Platonic thought with Christian doctrine. For Augustine, the self is fundamentally a soul created by and for God. He viewed the self as a spiritual entity that is in a constant search for divine truth and unity with God. Augustine's concept of the self is deeply introspective. In his work Confessions, he reflects on his own life, expressing the idea that the self is restless until it finds rest in God. He believed that true self-knowledge is achieved through understanding one's relationship with God, and that this relationship is central to the self's identity. Sin, for Augustine, distorts the self, leading it away from God, while grace restores the self to its true nature. The self, in Augustine's view, is characterized by its capacity to love, and its ultimate purpose is to seek and unite with the divine. This conception of the self influenced centuries of Christian thought, shaping the way the self is understood in a religious context. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, a medieval philosopher and theologian, built upon Augustine's ideas, but introduced a more systematic integration of Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology. Aquinas viewed the self as a composite of body and soul, with the soul being the form of the body. According to Aquinas, the soul is the principle of life and the seat of reason, which he considered the highest faculty of the self. Unlike Plato, who saw the body as a prison for the soul, Aquinas believed that the body and soul are intrinsically linked and that the human self cannot be fully understood without acknowledging this union. The soul animates the body, and together they form a single unified self. Aquinas also emphasized the importance of reason in understanding the self and its relationship with God. He argued that through reason, humans can discern moral laws and fulfill their purpose, which is to achieve eternal happiness in communion with God. The self for Aquinas is thus both a rational and spiritual being, with its ultimate goal being the fulfillment of its God-given nature. Jumping forward to the 17th century, we encounter René Descartes, a philosopher who revolutionized the way we think about the self. Descartes' most famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is the cornerstone of his philosophy. Descartes sought to establish a foundation of certain knowledge by doubting everything that could possibly be doubted. He found that while he could doubt the existence of the physical world, the other people, and even his own body, he could not doubt that he was doubting. This act of doubting proved that there must be a thinking self, a thinking thing, which exists. For Descartes, this thinking self, or mind, is the essence of our identity. Descartes' philosophy led to the concept of dualism, where the mind, or the self, is seen as a non-material thinking substance distinct from the body, which is material and extended in space. This dualistic view has profoundly influenced modern Western thought, particularly in discussions about the relationship between the mind and body and the nature of personal identity. John Locke offered a more empirically grounded view of the self, focusing on consciousness and memory. In his work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke argued that the self is not an immaterial substance, as Descartes suggested, but rather a continuity of consciousness. Locke proposed that personal identity is tied to memory. He suggested that what makes a person the same over time is not the substance of the soul or body, but the continuity of conscious experience. If you can remember past experiences, you are the same person who had those experiences. This means that the self is essentially a collection of memories and perceptions that persist over time. Locke's theory introduced the idea that personal identity is something that can change and evolve as our consciousness and memories change. This concept has had a lasting impact on discussions about the self, particularly in relation to psychological continuity and the nature of personal identity. Locke was an empiricist, meaning he believed that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience rather than innate ideas. He rejected the notion held by some of his predecessors, such as René Descartes, that certain concepts or principles are inherent in the human mind from birth. For Locke, the mind starts off as a blank slate, and it is only through interacting with the world, through seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, that the mind begins to accumulate ideas and form knowledge. This process of acquiring knowledge is gradual and ongoing throughout one's life. Locke's tabula rasa is closely connected to his theory of the self. According to Locke, the self is formed through the accumulation of experiences. As we perceive and reflect on our sensory experiences, we develop a sense of identity and personal consciousness. Locke believed that personal identity, or the sense of self, is primarily based on the continuity of consciousness. In other words, it is our ability to remember past experiences and link them to our present consciousness that forms the basis of our identity. The self, therefore, is not a static entity, but a dynamic one, shaped by our ongoing experiences and memories. In summary, Locke's concept of tabula rasa presents the self as a blank slate at birth, with personal identity and knowledge being formed through experience and memory. This view emphasizes the role of environmental influences and conscious reflection in shaping who we are, offering a dynamic and evolving conception of the self. David Hume. David Hume took Locke's empiricism to its logical extreme, offering a radical critique of the traditional notion of the self. Hume argued that when we took within, we don't find a stable, unified self. Instead, we find a bundle of perceptions, thoughts, sensations, and feelings that are constantly changing. In his work, A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume contended that the self is nothing more than a collection of these perceptions, which succeed one another with great rapidity and are in constant flux. He likened the self to a theater, where different perceptions pass in and out of view, but there is no underlying substance or self that experiences them. Hume's skepticism about the self challenges the very idea of a permanent identity. He suggested that the self is an illusion, a convenient fiction that we create to make sense of the continuity of our experiences. This view has influenced later thinkers, particularly in existentialist and postmodern philosophy, where the idea of a stable, coherent self is often questioned. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant offered a new perspective on the self by emphasizing its role as a rational agent. Kant introduced the concept of the transcendental self, which is the necessary condition for the possibility of experience. Kant argued that our experiences of the world are not just passively received, but are actively shaped by the mind's innate structures. The self, for Kant, is the subject that unifies and organizes these experiences. This transcendental self is not something we can perceive directly, but is a necessary precondition for any experience or knowledge. Kant also emphasized the moral dimension of the self. He believed that the self is autonomous, meaning it has the capacity to govern itself through reason. This autonomy is the basis of moral law, which Kant famously formulated as the categorical imperative: act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. For Kant, the self is a rational moral agent, capable of self-legislation and responsible for its actions. Moving into the 20th century, Sigmund Freud presented a more complex and dynamic model of the self. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, viewed the self as a battleground between different parts of the psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the primal unconscious part of the psyche that operates based on the pleasure principle. It seeks immediate gratification of basic instincts and desires, while the superego represents the internalized moral standards and ideals of society. It acts as a conscience, imposing guilt and striving for perfection. And lastly, the ego is the rational part of the psyche that mediates between the demands of the id and the constraints of the superego. It operates according to the reality principle, trying to find realistic ways to satisfy its desires without the bounds of social norms. Freud's model of the self portrays it as a site of constant conflict, with much of this conflict occurring in the unconscious mind. He believed that understanding the self requires delving into the unconscious and uncovering the hidden desires and traumas that shape our behavior. Freud's ideas have had a profound impact on psychology, influencing how we think about the self in terms of unconscious drives and the complexities of human motivation. Now we have Gilbert Ryle. Gilbert Ryle was a 20th century philosopher who challenged the Cartesian dualism of mind and body. In his book, The Concept of Mind, Ryle famously described the concept of the self as the ghost in the machine, a phrase he used to criticize the idea that the mind is a separate, non-physical substance that inhabits the body. Ryle argued that the self is not a mysterious inner entity, but rather a collection of behaviors and dispositions. He suggested that what we call the mind or self is simply the way we behave and interact with the world. The self is not something we have, but something we do. It is manifested in our actions, habits, and the way we respond to situations. Ryle's view is often associated with behaviorism, which emphasizes the study of observable behavior rather than internal mental states. His ideas challenge the notion of an inner self that is separate from the body and has influenced subsequent philosophical and psychological theories that focus on the observable aspects of human life. Next, we have Paul Churchland. Paul Churchland, a contemporary philosopher, takes a materialist view of the self, arguing that what we consider the self is actually a complex network of brain states. Churchland is a proponent of eliminative materialism, which suggests that common sense, psychological concepts like belief, desires, and the self are folk theories that will eventually be replaced by a more accurate scientific understanding of the brain. Churchland argues that as neuroscience advances, we will come to see that what we think of as the self is simply the result of neural processes in the brain. The self, in this view, is not a distinct entity, but a set of brain functions that produce our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. This perspective challenges traditional notions of the self as a unified, enduring entity and instead presents it as something that can be fully explained in terms of physical processes. Churchland's ideas are part of a broader trend in contemporary philosophy and science that seeks to understand human consciousness and identity through the lens of biology and neuroscience. This process or approach raises important questions about the nature of the self and whether it can be fully captured by scientific explanation. And lastly, Merleau-Ponty. Finally, we come to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher who emphasized the self as embodied. In contrast to the dualistic and materialistic views of the self, Merleau-Ponty argued that the self cannot be separated from its physical body or its experience of the world. In his major work, Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty proposed that our primary way of engaging with the world is through our body. The self is not just a mind or a brain, but an embodied being that perceives, moves, and interacts with the world. He criticized both Cartesian dualism, which separates mind and the body, and reductive materialism, which reduces the self to brain states. Merleau-Ponty introduced the concept of the lived body, which is not an object like other physical things, but the means through which we experience and understand the world. The self in this view is a being in the world where consciousness, body, and environment are interconnected. This perspective emphasizes the importance of lived experiences and the idea that our identity is shaped by our embodied interactions with the world around us. In this lecture, we've explored a wide array of philosophical perspectives on the self, from Socrates' call to know thyself to Merleau-Ponty's idea of the embodied self. Each philosopher we've discussed offers a unique lens through which to view the self, reflecting the richness and complexity of this fundamental concept. Understanding the self is not just an intellectual endeavor. It's essential to know how we navigate the world, make decisions, and relate to others. Whether we view the self as a rational agent, a bundle of perceptions, or a network of brain states, these perspectives invite us to reflect on our own existence and our place in the world. The philosophical inquiry into the self is ongoing, and as we continue to explore these ideas, we deepen our understanding of what it means to be human. Well, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion on these fascinating ideas.